Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. My guest for this episode was Alison Phipps, and Alison has just finished the book Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism. That is the title. I got it slightly wrong whilst interviewing her, which was a bit embarrassing. But Alison works at the University of Sussex, and her book Me Not You came out fairly recently. It came out in April 2020. Alison has also kindly given out a code so that you can get the book half price. So if you go to the Manchester Press website and find the book, if you put in the code OTH583, that's OTH583, you can get the book for around £6.50 plus postage and package. So thank you very much, Alison, for offering that code. That's really kind of you. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for talking to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Sure. My name's Alison Phipps, and I am Professor of Gender Studies at Sussex University. And I'm currently in lockdown in Brighton with my partner and 2 kids.
Great. I'm in Brighton as well, so it's a bit rainy today, but the weather's been great otherwise, hasn't it?
It has. It's been amazing. It's been amazing, yeah.
Great. And you work at Sussex University, you said, as well?
I do, and I've been at Sussex for 15 years. Yeah, 15.
And what's your background in the subject of sociology, Alison?
No, I have no background in sociology at all. I'm completely unqualified to be here. And when I started my lectureship, I think it's fair to say that I was just winging it. So I did a degree in politics and modern history at Manchester, and I also did a master's at Manchester in political theory. And then my PhD I did in sociology of education. So it was sociological, but it wasn't kind of the classical theorists or anything. So I applied for the job at Sussex because they were looking for somebody to cover gender studies for 9 months while somebody else was on a research contract. And then I just stayed. But yeah, I've been teaching sociology now for 15 years with no qualifications to do so. Yeah. I'm sorry.
and what's your kind of main area of interest, or is there a particular theory or sociologist that you really enjoy reading about or teaching?
Yeah, I mean, my main area is gender. So I have taught kind of sociology of gender and feminist theory and feminist research for the past 15 years. And I guess that's been the main kind of focus of my research as well. I have taught bits and pieces on other parts of sociology too. So I taught a module on the sociology of education. I teach bits on social theory modules, mostly the feminist bits, but I've also taught Bourdieu before and Foucault, and I've also taught qualitative methods. And in terms of the theories that have really inspired me, I think it's the feminist theory that really kind of grabbed my attention, and that's what got me interested in the topic at university. And actually it was Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, and I know Germaine Greer is really problematic now for very good reasons, but it was her book, The Female Eunuch, that kind of caught my attention. I remember reading it and kind of thinking, oh my God, this is me, or this is what I'm supposed to be, and this is what I'm being punished for not being. So that kind of feminine, submissive ideal that she was talking about, that was kind of effectively stripped of agency and sexuality and power, I really kind of identified with that. And my feminism wasn't very intersectional at the time because my life wasn't very intersectional. I grew up in a kind of lower middle class, very white sort of suburb. I hadn't yet come out as queer, and so my life was quite one-dimensional, which is, I think, why Greer's work sort of spoke to me. Now, of course, I can see that the sort of submissive femininity that she's talking about is a very white bourgeois femininity, but at the time, I felt like it was sort of universal. So that really got me into feminist theory, and then I sort of moved on from there. And now the kinds of theorists that really inspire me the most are the Black feminist theorists. Yeah. So Audre Lorde's work I absolutely love, Bell Hooks' work I absolutely love, and Angela Davis. But more recently, I've been really inspired by the work of Saidiya Hartman. Her recent book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, is just such an amazing read. And Christina Sharp as well, and her book In the Wake really had a profound effect on me when I first read it. So those are the types of things that I would really gravitate towards now, but I didn't then.
And it's interesting you mentioned intersectional feminists, because one of my, quite a few of my students often ask the question, what type of feminist is this researcher or writer? So before you perhaps referred to yourself as intersectional, how would you label yourself, if you like? Was there a particular branch of feminism you subscribe to?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think so, because I think to say that you become a bit of a hostage to fortune in a way. So I think I would never call myself an intersectional feminist, because intersectionality is so hard to do. So thinking intersectionally, it's not just about adding categories together. It's about understanding how systems work together. It's about understanding how heteropatriarchy, racial capitalism, colonialism, all kind of work in the same, what Patricia Hill Collins would call a matrix of domination. And I don't think that I will ever fully understand that. I'm kind of understanding bits and pieces, and hopefully my understanding is developing, but I'm not ever going to be there. So I don't think I would call myself an intersectional feminist, although I would say I try to think intersectionally. And in terms of other types of feminism, I think I draw from all kinds of different branches of feminism. I've been very influenced by Marxist feminism and kind of especially social reproduction theory. I've been very influenced by Black feminism and other feminisms of colour. As I've said, I've been influenced by queer feminism. Somebody like Sarah Ahmed is a big influence for me, and by radical feminism as well. So even though I now see the weaknesses of the radical feminist framework, there's also something very powerful about it, and its analysis of patriarchy, I think, is valuable in some ways. So I think we can kind of take what we like from different feminist perspectives to inform our own vision, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And despite saying that about feminism, I know the main thing that I'd like to talk to you about is your new book, Me Not You. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the research first, before we start to break that down a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, the book, I think, comes out of 15 years or more of my own research and activism around sexual violence. So I've been involved particularly in the movement around sexual violence against students, sexual violence in universities. And that happened mainly because when I started at Sussex as Director of Gender Studies, students started coming to me and telling me about things that had happened to them. And I really got into it that way and started to have conversations with the NUS at the time about what they were planning to do. And we ended up working collaboratively together on the issue. And after that, I did a number of different research projects. I worked with NUS a bit more. I worked with Universities UK. I collaborated with colleagues across higher education. And got involved really in a movement of people that were trying to tackle the issue. But I found myself feeling more and more uneasy about some of the things that were being done and some of the methods that were being used in order to try to get attention and to try to deal with the problem. And my main question, well, I had a few questions, I guess. The first question was around the kind of naming and shaming of perpetrators and the use of the corporate media for feminist ends. And I always felt uneasy about that because media markets are nihilistic, like any markets, and the media using our experiences as clickbait doesn't necessarily mean that they support us. and I'd seen a couple of incidents where a survivor had themselves been vilified by the media because that happened to be the better story. And I kind of thought that can't be, we can't rely on the media. And I understand that that's sometimes the last resort for people when the institutions let you down, the communities let you down, everybody else let you down, you have nothing left to do but to name and shame in the media. But I really felt uneasy about that. And my other question really was, where do they go? Especially when we're talking about faculty who are sexually harassing or abusing students and who maybe are excluded from particular institutions, but where do they go after that? Do they go to another institution? Sometimes they do, and they continue to behave exactly the same, and that's called the pass the harasser problem, which is a problem in academia but also in other high status sectors. Or maybe we decide that we don't want them ever to get an academic job again, so we name them repeatedly. But then where do they go? Yeah. You know, they must go and make a livelihood somewhere. So do they go to a lower status sector where potentially women have less rights, less protections, less opportunities for agency? So that was another question. And I guess as well, through my sort of engagements with Black feminism, I was developing a real critique and a real revulsion for the criminal punishment system, and thinking, well, how can we do something different? And then when Me Too kind of went viral, I mean, obviously Me Too started a long time before that, when Tarana Burke started her program of work. But when the hashtag went viral, I had a similar sense of unease about all these men who are losing their jobs, but where do they go? And about the kind of media feeding frenzy around these very, very painful experiences that people were sharing. And I wasn't the only person to feel uneasy about it by any means. And a lot of the arguments I make in the book are kind of citing and drawing on Black feminists and other feminists of colour who've said the same things, not least Tarana Burke, who is the founder of Me Too, who's kind of been like the movement's critical friend in a way. So that was really where the book came from, and I think that it brought together just all of my experiences and all of my views about how this form of feminism works, because I'm kind of a mainstream feminist. I'm an academic, I'm white, even though I don't come from an academic family, and I'm probably less middle class than some of my colleagues. I'm very much in a middle class situation now, so I'm part of that mainstream movement. So I guess I wanted to kind of write an account of the movement from the inside, and an account of the movement kind of directed towards women like me who maybe were sitting there thinking, I'm not sure this is quite right, I don't know whether I want to do this.
Yeah. So actually, if we could break the title down a little bit. So the first part of it is Me, Not You. So
yeah,
do you want to explain that bit, and then we'll look at the second part of the title in a moment?
Sure, yeah. So the Me, Not You is a kind of a play on Me Too. So what I argue in the book is, despite the kind of appearance of solidarity that the phrase Me Too sort of communicates, actually mainstream feminism is more often saying me, not you, because it's focused on the experiences and the traumas of bourgeois white women, and those women tend to want to have their injuries dealt with in any way possible, and often the types of interventions that they want are harmful to other groups. So it's a me, not you in terms of who's represented, but it's also a me, not you in terms of what we are demanding, which is sometimes not the best thing for everyone. So for instance, getting rid of perpetrators from our universities and effectively outsourcing them to sort of lower status sectors, or demanding more police, more prisons, longer sentences, etc., and bolstering the criminal punishment system, which only really serves to harm more marginalised people. So the criminal punishment system was not set up to deal with men like Harvey Weinstein. Yeah. It was set up to protect men like Harvey Weinstein and to put away the others. So mostly it was set up to deal with people of colour, and especially Black people, but also working class white people, as a means of social control, as a means of dealing with people who are unemployed, underemployed, precariously employed, dealing with people that shouldn't be out in public, shouldn't be on the streets, dealing with people that society doesn't really want anymore and wants to be put away. So that's where the me, not you comes from. It's, in focusing on me, sometimes I am actually harming you. And then I argue in the book that sometimes this mainstream feminism slips into a more reactionary form where marginalized people, instead of just being the kind of collateral of the mainstream feminist movement that are just kind of ridden roughshod over, or they're kind of offered up as a sacrifice by some of the things that the movement does, they actually become the enemy. And that's the case, especially when it comes to sex workers and trans people, whose politics really challenges some of the deeply held assumptions of a kind of white bourgeois feminism. And some parts of that movement have kind of turned against those more marginalized women. So that's where the me, not you becomes really quite nasty.
Yeah, we'll delve into that a little bit more, I think. But I was even more interested with the second part of the title, is mainstream feminism broken?
That's not the title of the book. So the title of the book is Me, Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism. Is mainstream feminism broken was a kind of subline that I think Sussex University used in a video that they did about me. So that's not my kind of line. I mean, actually, I had some thoughts when I saw that, because I don't think mainstream feminism is broken. I think mainstream feminism is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to advance the interests of privileged white women, sometimes at the expense of others. So, I mean, I've said this before, when people kind of say to me that anti-trans and anti-sex work feminists are not real feminists, I kind of have an issue with that idea that there can be an authentic feminism and that these feminists aren't part of it, because actually the history of feminism is quite a problematic history, and feminism is not just one thing. And if you're looking at mainstream feminism, if you look at something like the suffragettes, some women who were activists for women's suffrage were also activists against the suffrage of people of colour or working class people. Some of those women were also eugenicists. So, and to kind of try to disclaim them from the feminist movement, especially when white women do it, I kind of think, no, we can't disclaim those women. We have to look at where that's come from, because the remnants of that are still active in our mainstream feminist politics. And it can also very quickly get quite extreme, as you can see with some of the sort of reactionary feminist alliances that have been made with parts of the far right.
So is that what you mean by the trouble with contemporary feminism?
So that's the kind of the trouble with it is, I'm kind of trying to explore some of the problems with it at a time, I think, when feminism is having a resurgence, and when women's rights are kind of been rolled back and women's rights are under attack, but there's also been a massive kind of pro-feminist movement and a massive resurgence, and a lot of women have found their power. But I think some white women, privileged white women, have found their power in quite problematic ways, and maybe are seeking what Nancy Fraser would call equal opportunity domination. Nancy Fraser and Tithi Bhattacharya, so they want to be in charge with the white men. They're not seeking a kind of end to that kind of power.
I see. That gets really complex, doesn't it? That gets really deep. I know one of the phrases used in your book is about political whiteness. I wondered if you could explain that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, so political whiteness I used to try to expand some of the discussions that we've had recently about white feminism. So you've probably seen that, in the media, white feminism is becoming much more discussed. And white feminism is essentially what I'm talking about. It's a feminism which is focused on privileged white women to the exclusion of, or sometimes to the harm of, others. But political whiteness expresses some of the similarities between white feminism and other forms of politics which are dominated by white people. So that could be kind of mainstream liberal politics, or it could be more reactionary politics. So political whiteness, I argue, is a kind of orientation to politics. It's a mode of political behaviour which expresses a kind of privileged whiteness. And it has three main elements. The first one is narcissism. So my needs are more important than everybody else's, or my needs, my interests, my experiences can stand in for those of everyone else. So there's kind of a lack of appreciation of difference. And then there's a kind of alertness to threat. And I think that comes from being in a position of supremacy. We are kind of alert to anything which might harm that supremacy. So in some ways, being in a position of supremacy is a very fragile position. And that alertness to threat you can see in the kind of backlash and kind of Brexit politics that we've got around at the moment, the Brexit Trump type politics, which is all about a threatened whiteness. A whiteness under threat by immigrants, by social justice warriors, by feminists, by queers, by trans people, or whoever. But you can also see that at work in mainstream feminism, which is very much focused on women being under threat. And of course, women are under threat, and sexual violence is a very real threat. And I don't want to downplay that. But what I'm saying is that sometimes focusing on that sense of threat or that sense of injury can be a little bit counterproductive when it starts to interact with that narcissism, I guess, and produce quite an inward focus and lack of care, or sometimes a hostility towards marginalized people, because then they become experienced as threatening as well to power. So when we feel threatened, we seek power in order to make us feel less threatened. And you can see that in the Brexit slogan, "Take back control," or the "Make America Great Again" slogan of the Trump supporters. But you can also see that in mainstream feminism, which can be quite vindictive and quite punitive and quite vengeful. And it doesn't mean that it's not rooted in very real experiences of pain and trauma. It is. But sometimes I think that as privileged white people, we default to the kind of punishing action rather than thinking about, well, how do we minimize harm for everybody? So that's what I call political whiteness. And I think that brings together mainstream feminism and the backlash against feminism. There are kind of themes that the two of them have in common, which I explain and explore in the book. And it also unites some parts of reactionary feminism with the far right. So I talk in the last chapter of the book about some of the ideological similarities between anti-trans and anti-sex work feminism and parts of the far right. And also I talk about some of the practical associations that have been made between feminist groups and groups that you would never expect feminists to associate with, because they have a shared antipathy towards sex workers and increasingly towards trans people. So the anti-trans thing is really kind of stepping up.
Thank you very much, Alison. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, I think we've still got quite a lot to unpack. Thank you. Hi, welcome back to part two. I'm talking to Professor Alison Phipps, the author of Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism. And Alison, I wanted to unpack a few of the other words that you talked about in the first part of the show. You mentioned heteropatriarchy. For those that might not know or haven't heard the word before, did you want to say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Okay, well, patriarchy in its very basic form refers to the domination of women by men, which some feminists and some radical feminists have kind of theorized as the first form of oppression. So nobody knows really why or where it came from. The radical feminist theory is that it's rooted in kind of women's reproductive capacities and men's need to control those capacities. So the person that carries and gives birth to and cares for infants becomes subordinate to the person who needs to ensure that their children are actually their own, their offspring are actually their own. And there's quite a lot of feminist books that do sort of thought experiments about how and why patriarchy might have emerged. And of course, there's evidence that patriarchy emerged in some places and not in others as well. So patriarchy predates capitalism, at least in Western countries, but it was kind of intensified by capitalism, because what capitalism did was separated production from reproduction, and then made women responsible for the reproductive sphere and men responsible for doing productive work. And of course, that's a bit of a false binary, because women have always worked. But then what happens is that women who work are also then responsible for the household and for care of children and for care of relatives. And when women do work, they tend to work in sectors of the economy which are concerned with kind of maintaining and caring for human life. And we call that heteropatriarchy because it's based on the model of a binary relationship, a relationship of two people, one of whom is a man, one of whom is a woman, and one of whom is masculine and one of whom is feminine, and kind of sex and gender are thought to be matched up with each other. So if you're assigned female at birth, you're supposed to be feminine, and if you're assigned male at birth, you're supposed to be masculine, etc. And capitalism relies on that form of society because it relies on that division of labour, where half of the population go out and do productive work and the other half care for the labour force and everybody else, but without getting paid. So capitalism relies on what's called social reproduction, which is not just the care of children, but it's care in general, but it doesn't want to foot the bill. And that is still the case. And I think we can see that incredibly clearly now in the middle of this pandemic, that we're in the midst of a crisis of social reproduction. And it's become very, very clear that capitalist mode of organizing society is kind of unsustainable, especially when we live in a form of capitalism that has systematically over a period of time disinvested even more in social reproduction than it was before. So that is what heteropatriarchy is. So heterosexuality is not just a sexual preference, it is a structure, and it is a norm that facilitates economic relations. And that is the reason why we are all socialized to be heterosexual, even though many of us are not.
Yeah. And I know we shouldn't really say this as sociologists because we tend to go for the nurture rather than nature, but where do you stand on people that say, well, that is just biology. We are biologically different. Women give birth, all of the different biological arguments. Where does that stand?
Well, as a sociologist, I don't really believe in innate anything. I mean, obviously, bodies are different. And some people give birth to children. Some people do not give birth to children. But I think that doesn't necessarily say anything about our gender. And I think that we will never know what gender could be in a society without those heteropatriarchal structures that kind of sort us into one of two categories. I believe that gender can be quite deeply felt, and I think there's been some quite interesting conversations between sociologists of gender and trans sociologists and trans feminists and theorists who have taken issue with the idea of kind of strong social construction and said, well, if nothing's innate, then how do I know that I'm trans? How could I have known that I was trans from a very young age? I believe in a kind of innate sense of self. And I think that gender and the gender binary is one of the key structures through which we understand ourselves. So I think that makes it highly likely that we will identify with one side or the other of the gender binary as we're growing up. And we'll also perhaps feel like we don't identify with either side of the gender binary.
The other thing I was quite interested to ask you, I'm going to ask you a very question from a male point of view. Do you think that the patriarchy damages males as well as females? Because often, I'm just going to be honest, talking very much from a male point of view. I've read a lot of feminism about how patriarchy is damaging to females, but do you think it is damaging to males as well?
Yes, I do. I think that it kind of dangerous to sort of say patriarchy hurts men too, to imply patriarchy hurts men in all kinds of ways. So patriarchy hurts gay men and other queer men who don't kind of conform to traditional masculinity, or any man that doesn't conform to traditional masculinity. But also the norm of masculinity hurts men who conform to it, because it says you're not allowed to share your feelings. I mean, there's a reason why men are much more likely to take their own lives than women are, because patriarchy stops them from having outlets to be able to deal with their feelings. So I absolutely benefit from patriarchy while at the same time being damaged by it.
Yeah. So one of the areas that I'm interested in is a lot of males perhaps don't attune to the feminist movement, and often they see the feminist movement as a campaign for female rights rather than gender equality. Is that something that you've kind of encountered in your own research as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly encountered those views, and I think that to a certain extent that's true, because feminism is a movement about the oppression of women, and so historically we have looked more at women's experiences than men's, and I think that there's also a balancing thing there, about kind of history and literature and all these kind of fields of study having been male dominated, so there's a need to sort of balance the scales, but I actually don't. I think it depends what part of feminism you're talking about, and I think that feminism has become much more inclusive as it's become more intersectional, because if you take an intersectional perspective, you can't have a very simple kind of women are the victims and men are the perpetrators perspective. You really can't, especially if you look at some of the ways in which white women have been part of the victimization of men of color, for example. So I think that the movement has become more inclusive, and I've seen much more engagement by men with the feminist movement in different ways. And of course, if you talk about gender, studies and queer studies as opposed to women's studies, then that's much, much more diverse. So I have had men in my classes for a long time. I've had non-binary people in my classes for a long time. I think there's always an issue around space. And I think that when we have these discussions about who is given space in the feminist movement, we have to be quite kind of careful about that, because sometimes there's a need to focus more on some people than others, and I feel like we should always focus on the people who are the most marginalized, which doesn't mean that we have to do the kind of competitive oppression Olympics type stuff, but I think that we need to make sure that that's where our focus is, because actually that then trickles up, and if we make life easier for the people who are at the sharpest end of oppressive systems, that will kind of end up helping all of us. So I think that's my kind of view on that. And I say that to myself as well. I mean, I say that to somebody that's just written a book about how white women take up too much space in feminism.
The reason I ask is if you take any sort of gender debate on Twitter, it becomes into a bit of a mudslinging contest between males and females, but different groups as well, and it can get quite nasty. I just wonder how we can bring the movement together rather than be quite divisive.
I mean, I think Twitter can be a hellhole. I mean, it's very difficult to have productive conversations on Twitter. I think that the main benefit and what I find really great about Twitter is just the ability to listen. So when people are talking about their experience, when people are sharing their work, I think Twitter has been a real godsend for me, especially when I was kind of having my kids and at home on maternity leave and not able to travel and talk to people. It was just really great to go and listen to people, especially people coming from much more marginalized positions than I was. But I think having any kind of constructive dialogue on Twitter is really, really hard. And it's become increasingly difficult because there seems to be now a lot of interference from accounts who don't really have good faith. Yeah.
And so do you mention in the book any areas where you think we can improve the feminist movement? What needs to happen for it to improve, develop?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that we all need to speak together about this. I would like the business of any gender about how to move forward and how to move forward in ways that don't hurt the most marginalized people among us. I mean, I end the book with a series of questions that privileged white feminists can ask themselves, about their politics. So I don't mean to kind of encourage navel gazing, because I think there's enough of that amongst white women already, but in order to kind of inform action, which is a little bit less narcissistic, a little bit less problematic in the ways that I've outlined. But I don't have any of the answers, and I think that we need to kind of, I don't see myself as a leader of feminism at all. I think we need to kind of grapple towards those answers together. And I think that sometimes it might be different depending on where you're located. So there's stuff about kind of perpetrators in institutions. What do we do about them? I think that answer may be different depending on your institution, or even on your kind of department or your lab or your research group or what have you. And I think that it's the younger ones amongst us who are more likely to come up with the answers as well. I mean, I'm rapidly going out of date here, so it's for young feminists really to take us into the future.
Well, that was going to be my final question, actually, to ask you if you think there is progress. Are you seeing progress among the younger generations?
Definitely. I think the kids are all right. I really do. Yeah. I mean, I think that feminists of, the younger generations, my students and people who are, older than them as well, because I'm quite old now, I think, I see them being much more intersectional. I see them being much kinder. I see them being much more sophisticated in their politics. And that's not to kind of construct some sort of false generational divide, because I think there are plenty of feminists in the older generations who are amazing and who I really admire and look up to as well. But I have seen progress in feminism into the younger generations. I think that I learn a tremendous amount from my students and from other young feminists that I follow on Twitter.
Well, that's a good note to end on, certainly, isn't it? Now we can see progress and we can see a good future. And Alison, I just wanted to ask where people can buy your book, read your book. Have you got a blog and you use Twitter as well? I know that.
I use Twitter. I'm Alison Phipps, all one word, on Twitter. I've got a blog. I think that if you type in phipps.space, it should take you to my blog, but you can also access my blog via my Twitter page as well. And you can buy my book from Manchester University Press, and they've currently got an offer on which has made it half price. Yeah, so it's OTH 583, and if you go to Manchester University Press and put that code in, then it will get you the book for £6.50 plus postage and packing. You can also get it on Google Play Books if you want an ebook, or other places.
Great, thank you very much for that, Alison, and best wishes for the future. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.